Hello and welcome to this lecture on Magic Art with Robert Orme. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces for this penultimate lecture in Robert's Magical Art series. If you missed any of the series or would like to see any of the lectures again, recordings are on the Latimer Foundation website, and I'll share a link at the end of the talk. We're delighted also that so many of you have donated week on week for the wonderful cause that is Robert's bursary. Your help enables us to offer a Latimer education to a bright student from a state school who wishes to study history of art, and we are so grateful for your donations. Since our Virtually Speaking series began, we have raised over £10,000 for bursaries here at Latimer. Before we start, a couple of house rules. Everyone will be on mute so you can all hear the presentation clearly. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat facility and Robert will answer as many as time allows at the end of his talk. For this lecture, Robert will take us to the yet wilder shores of magical art with the art of the modern occult in the paintings of Gill, Crowley and Osmond Spare. So, without further ado, it's over to Robert.
Thank you. What we're going to do might be subtitled The Magical Art of Ecstasy. And if you look at the title of the talk, it's actually got magic spelt with the letter K, and that implies that it's to do with the beliefs of the occult groups that came around in the early 20th century around Alistair Crowley and Osmond Spare. Now, you may remember that the last talk we were in Germany, and we were looking at the sort of paganism that appeared in the art of Theos. And if you go back to those paintings that we looked at from Theos, if Tony, you could bring them up, we're going to remember how Theos was part of the life reform movement in Germany, and how life reform was all about getting back to nature, getting back to being one with the universe, and how Theos promoted this kind of cult of the sun. And you can see this drawing by him is showing, previous picture, Tony. This picture here is showing how these naked people, because that was part of the life reform movement, are all reverentially moving towards a giant temple that you can see in the distance. And we looked at all those big, enormous temple designs that he made that were never built. But this temple, as you can see, is silhouetted against the sun. And his most famous picture is the sun worshipper, which became a kind of almost emblem for the life reform movement in Germany, where the force of man, the spirit of man, is on this peak and his arms are open and he's up worshipping the sun. Now, that was in Germany in the 1890s, but in England in the early 20th century, there was also a movement of what was called Neo-Paganism. This is a good book about it by Paul Delaney, and the term neo-pagan was coined by Virginia Woolf, and it was often as a movement focused around Rupert Brooke, whose portrait is on the book cover. And don't only know Rupert Brooke because of the war poetry, and there is a field and so on, but also look him up and find out what his earlier interests were and his earlier poetry, because in 1909 or so, he was part of what was called a neo-pagan movement. And you get in this next picture the kind of way in which the neo-pagans tried to get away from the city, and they tried instead to go and literally camp in the countryside. And what they were doing was very similar to life reform. They were going to be vegetarians. They liked to wear sandals. They liked to camp literally with nature. They took up the ideas of Edward Carpenter on leading the new, simple, natural life. They believed strongly in connecting with all this nature that is around them. Virginia Woolf remembered swimming naked with Rupert Brooke at river at Grantchester. This camp is likely to be somewhere down in Dorset, where they went and they wrote evocatively about nature and getting back to nature and living with nature. Probably the artist whose ideas are most similar to that is going to be Augustus John, who at this time was a famous society painter. He made his money out of doing pictures and paintings of the rich and famous, but he himself was also trying to live as a bohemian, And one of his ideas was that he and his large family should get away and literally go caravanning. And this photo is of him and his girlfriends and his children going out camping. And as you can see, it's meant to be a gypsy caravan. And he got very interested in the gypsies. He met them, talked with them. He learnt Romany. He studied their mythology and folklore. And he did a series of etchings called Idyls of the Gypsies. And these two naked women in the next picture, these are idyls of the gypsies. And they represented for him a life of freedom, a life of getting back to and being with nature, of freedom about sex and nudity, and also of beliefs in kind of witchcraft. And therefore, he was somebody who himself tried to live this kind of pagan, back to nature kind of lifestyle. And in 1912 or so, he did this large painting called Lyric Fantasy, which is meant to be an allegory of what had happened in his life in the last few years. He famously had married one woman, Ida, and had children with her, but also at the same time had a mistress, Dorelia, with whom he also had children, with whom they all lived together. And therefore, this picture is meant to be an idyll of the kind of life that they were able to lead. He went and lived in a kind of commune in the south of France, or this is probably in Dorset. And the woman playing the music is the dead wife, Ida, who died. And then the nude is Dorelia. And then you can see that they produced quite a lot of children and then set out to live this kind of idyllic lifestyle back to nature as kind of neo-pagans. But as well as neo-paganism, there were also lots of other kind of movements at the time which were going to link in to this idea. In 1911 or so, Jacob Epstein was one of the up-and-coming sculptors in England. So if you look at Epstein's fame, he was born in America in New York, he came over and trained in Paris, then he was in England, and in London he was in the Bohemian group around Ezra Pound, and therefore he got asked by the followers of Oscar Wilde to design this, which is the Oscar Wilde tomb in Père Lachaise. And famously, he sculpted it with a kind of demon of lust, which is what is on the, which is carved above him on the tomb. And it created a big scandal because when the demon of lust was originally created, it had a large penis and testicles that you can't see because when it was unveiled, the authorities didn't like it and they actually covered it over with a tarpaulin. Alistair Crowley, when he visited this tomb, disapproved and therefore tore off the covering. But by the 1960s, it had been literally chipped off by somebody, and allegedly the penis and testicles were kept in the custodian's lodge at the entrance to Père Lachaise. So Jacob Epstein was a radical sculptor. He produced these kind of very innovative modernist kind of sculptures and was interested in all sorts of the new ideas. He was linked to Lewes in Sussex because one of his patrons, Edward Warren, very rich American, was actually buying up lots of art. He, for example, bought the Rodin Kiss that is now in the Tate, and therefore promoted and helped Epstein to plan one of his big hopes. He hoped, like Phidias, to build a giant temple on the downs outside Lewes. And it was going to be, he said, he hoped, like a new kind of Stonehenge. And it was going to be to celebrate the primeval gods and forces of the universe, and in particular, to worship the sun. Therefore, he did a whole series of versions of sun gods. And if you look at this image here, on the left, you have little maquettes, probably made out of clay. And when you look on the right, you can see a relief that he did actually carve. And look, they are actually based on the Phidias sun worshipper, which is now going to be built in the down on Sussex near Lewes. And he produced these images of these figures in ecstasy worshipping the sun, holding up their hands to it. And then he also produced images which were going to be much more primitive. When you look at this next sun god, you can see here how the finished work, which is now in the Tate, was going to be an image of the force of the male fertility god, probably Apollo, and again with his arms extended as if in a cross, as a kind of pagan crucifix, but arms extended up to the sun. And this sculpture is actually two-sided. This is the sun god, and then when you turn it over, you get this massive god here, which is carved in relief with the powerful muscles, and then with all these babies and things like that, which are the creation force within the universe. And the preparatory drawing for this sculpture here is labeled Primeval Gods. And what he's doing is to try and get back to the primitive worship of nature that he believed had been around with early man, and which he admired because he thought it showed kind of force and spirit that was there in the beliefs of the ancient peoples. And if you think of this as being 1910, look at the actual style. This is actually English primitivism. And if you were in Paris in 1910, you'd have been going to Cubist exhibitions. And the Cubist exhibitions were just by this stage beginning to use African masks and Iberian sculptures. And therefore, this sculpture by Epstein is part of the European modernist primitivism that was developing in the early 20th century and represented to these artists power and force that you could get into the figures. But he was collaborating at this time with Eric Gill. Gill had been living literally next to me at the moment here. I'm in Hammersmith, down by the Black Lion, and Black Lion Lane was the place where Eric Gill briefly lived. But then he moved down to Ditchling in Sussex, and he was friendly with Epstein, and he was also involved in doing sculptures which were going to go onto this Temple of the Sun on the Downs. And this is a preparatory drawing that he did for one of his figures. And as again, you see, it is going to be raising its arms to worship the sun. But Gill wasn't only interested in solar male figures, he was also interested in the primitive female mother goddesses that were around. And this is either called Roland for Oliver or Life Force, Life Pleasure. And it shows you Gill carving, remarkable for its date because it's directly carved into the stone rather than being based on drawings and clay models. And he worked directly in a primitive way into the stone itself. And he produced this very forceful image of a woman, literally hands on her hips as if she's Henry VIII, and where she is actually meant to represent full-breasted, full-bodied, powerful mother figure of primitive religion. And it's therefore not surprising that in 1911, in the second post-impressionist exhibition organized by Roger Fry, Gill's sculptures were on show like this, placed in front of Matisse's La Danse, which is also a celebration of the life force. And therefore, in the early 20th century, Epstein and Gill were actually creating a kind of special magical pagan art in their sculptures. And later, both of them obviously develop and change their styles. But at this point, they're taking up the occult tradition of the pagan from Germany. Now, we've seen in previous talks that actually the modern art movements were much influenced by another occult movement, Theosophy. And Theosophy was based in London and Gloucester Terrace, but it also had its headquarters in India. And this is a representation of Madame Blavatsky at Adyar in the pavilion that she had built there. And the Blavatsky Theosophy was uniting all the religions together. So she took some ideas from pagan religions, Christian religions, but also lots of Buddhist and Hindu religions. And here at Adyar, she had a special box where overnight would appear messages written down from masters like Kuthumi in Tibet, who gave her her inspiration to write her books, and are now believed to obviously have been written by her herself, but actually show the way in which they actually had got to a kind of interest in and knowledge of other world religions, and in particular of the Buddhist and Hindu traditions. But at this date, they were also getting interested in another aspect of Hindu religion, which is going to be to do with Tantra. When you look at this next picture, you're looking at an image of Tantric Gods, which is a system of belief in ancient India, which is on exhibition at the moment, but probably closed, at the British Museum. They've got this special exhibition of Tantric Art. And what you've got here is the kind of manuscripts that they produced. But most famously, India was famous for, in the south, all these Hindu temples which had these kind of tantric carvings on them, where you can see the very physical images of female goddesses. You can see all sorts of strange postures and positions of having sex, because that was what Tantra was famous for. By the 1960s, Tantra meant tantric sex. So if you look at this poster from the 1960s, this is very much part of hippie culture, isn't it? Where Tantra was supposed to be a special art of magic. But it was known about in Victorian England. All you've got to do is to think of Sir Richard Burton and how he translated Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra. And there was then an Indian army officer called Edward Sellam who produced this book on the sacred writings of Hindus, originally published in 1866. He was an Indian army officer. He led a scandalous life with various affairs. Later in his life, he wrote pornographic novels and illustrated them himself. And this book was his attempt to understand what actually the ideas of Tantra were about. Because Tantra is a system of belief which is based around the origins of the universe, and the origins of the universe being based on the male and female principles that are around. And the sacred writings of the Hindus explains puja. And puja is the tantric word for worship, where you actually worship the male and female principles in the universe in the form of the lingam and the yoni. And the lingam is the stone that is carved to be the phallus, and the yoni is the cup, which is created to be the vagina. And the tantric universe claimed that everything in creation actually came from these basic male and female principles. And then the art of Tantra, sacred puja, consisted in libating lingams and yonis, but it also consisted in what Sellam was describing as virtually orgies, where people were going to get together and have sex, like in the images on the Hindu temple, but they were doing it for a spiritual kind of reason. The belief being that you could actually rise to a higher level of consciousness, to a more spiritual world through the physical processes of sex. And therefore, these kind of books were widely available in England. This edition is much later than the original, and it was produced by a publisher called Carrington in Paris and was sold in bookshops in London. Therefore, you begin to get the influence of these tantric ideas on these sculptors. Because if you go to the Tate, you may be lucky enough to see works by Epstein like this. And this is Epstein in his studio carving a female figure, which created a big scandal because he was actually carving it for the new BMA building in the Strand. And if you look at the building designed by whom, you can see the building itself is a kind of classical design, but look at the sculptures that are along it as if they're on some sort of a Hindu temple. And when you go into close-up on an individual sculpture, and they were much criticized and attacked and mutilated, you can see how this is very voluptuous female view of buttocks and how the figure is swaying and how it's actually obviously influenced by Hindu erotic sculpture. And if this is tantric, think of what Eric Gill was going to get into. If you go to the Tate, you can see this, which is a kind of monolith, which is called Ecstasy. And as you can see, it is again a coupling of male and female, derived from the things that he'd seen and heard about from Indian temple sculptures, and very explicitly showing the couple having sex, but in this kind of monolithic form, where the impetus of the sculpture is to rise up and show them as if rising to what he called ecstasy. And he also even put on public show this relief sculpture, which he entitled Votes for Women, because it actually shows the woman on top of the man. And again, what he's doing is to take the Indian ideas of tantric sex and then put them together into what is going to be modernist kind of sculpture. And after this, as you probably know, he went on to have a very scandalous life, so he's now a very controversial figure. And he turned into Catholicism, and most of his later erotic art is actually going to be Christian rather than pagan or Hindu. But at this early stage, 1910, 1911, he was much influenced by what was going on in Tantra. So we've seen that there were these occult movements around at this time. And what we're going to do now is to go into the deeper levels of occult and look at the way in which Alistair Crowley was going to, first of all, create a magical system and then move into actually creating art. So this is the young Alistair Crowley. This is him skinny dipping in the Himalayas because he was a keen mountaineer and went climbing in the Himalayas in the early 1900s. But all this was very much against his own background. He came from a wealthy brewing family, therefore he actually had money to live off for the first part of his life. His family had been part of the Brethren of Christianity, and therefore he had a very strict religious upbringing, and he basically rejected it and went against it, and went to Cambridge University from 1895 to 1898. And when he was there, he was mostly known as a writer, and he self-published lots and lots of books of poetry, which were very much erotic and very much describing his love life. And all the way through his life, he was bisexual. He'd had experiences with an actress when he was young. He used prostitutes. He did eventually marry for a while a woman called Rose, but he also had homosexual affairs. And when he was at Cambridge, this is his boyfriend, who is actually Harry Pollitt in his role as Diana de Pougy, in other words, transvestite. And he was connected with the decadent movement in the 1890s. And Harry Pollitt got Beardsley to do this bookplate for him, Mr. Pollitt's bookplate, which is full of the ideas of decadence. And therefore, Crowley first became known as a decadent poet, writing very much in the style of Swinburne, with lots of emphasis on erotic descriptions and metaphors of female beauty, of masochism and sadism. And he delighted in producing the most obscene books that he could. Therefore, the book that created the biggest scandal, for obvious reasons, was entitled by him White Stains. And inside it includes all sorts of descriptions of the sexual life he was enjoying with his girl and boy friends. This book is valuable if you come across it in a secondhand bookshop by chance, because it was printed in Paris, and when it was being smuggled into England, most of the copies were seized by the customs and destroyed, but you can get various reprints of it as well. But basically, his early career, he was known as a poet. But he was around in the 1890s, and as you heard in the last talk, there was a movement of the occult that was taken up by decadent artists and writers, for example, in the Golden Dawn. And you remember we looked at this picture of MacGregor Mathers, who was the founder of the Golden Dawn, in his ceremonial dress for occult rituals. He studied in the British Museum and published all sorts of books of ceremonial magic, and then tried to recreate the rituals in the lodges that he set up in West London. And this is Crowley as a member of the Golden Dawn. But Crowley's career was notoriously going to actually be a case of get involved and then take over anything that he could. And therefore, famously, he came to this lodge of the Golden Dawn, which is at 36 Blythe Road in Hammersmith. And in one of the upper rooms, there was all this decoration for lodge meetings. And he famously broke in, changed the lock, locked out MacGregor Mathers, and tried to actually take over the Golden Dawn. And it was very much based in around us in West London, because Yeats was in Chiswick, his girlfriend, Florence Farr, was in Dowling Road, And here in Blythe Road was one of the Golden Dawn's lodges. But he wasn't satisfied with just the Golden Dawn, and his own magical career really begins in 1904 when he went to Egypt. He was staying there, and he learned all sorts of secrets that he then published in this magazine called the Equinox. And as you can see, it has got all sorts of occult symbols on the cover. It was published at a high price for devotees who paid for membership of his orders, bought up this book. And in it, he published lots of his books on alchemy and astrology and traditional magic. And it's full of images like this, which is the sigils that are derived from ceremonial magic. And the idea of a sigil is from the Latin word for a seal, and it's where you actually get the imprint of a spirit. And these patterns, these designs, are meant to be the names of, for example, planetary spirits or of devils and demons. And the idea in a magic ritual is that you actually have a piece of wax or lead, you imprint on it, you seal into it the name of the spirit that you're trying to invoke. And then when you perform the ritual, the spirit will actually come down and be present in your ritual. And this was what he got from the Golden Dawn magic. But he developed his own system of magic from when he was in Egypt in 1904. He was on holiday, and his wife, Rose, had a dream where she said that he ought to go and visit in the Egyptian Museum this stelae, which is a vision of the god Horus. And when he was there, he later claimed that he actually had a revelation, a vision of Horus, who came and spoke to him. And we can know what he said because there are surviving manuscripts of what he was doing, which he then had printed. And this is the Liber Vel Legis, the book of the law. And this is the printed version. Then you can see here a manuscript, Liber L. And then you've got the actual text, and it says, doesn't it? So that by light in me, he believed that the spirit came into him in the museum, entered him, and taught him the secret truths of magic. And the book of the law was about the law of Leymah, Thelema. And that translates as something like, do as thou will, because Leymah is the Greek word for will. And this became a new system of magic that he actually developed, where he believed that you could actually have magic powers to get what you will as and whenever you want it. Now that is his new kind of religion, and it goes very much against, doesn't it, the ideas that he'd been growing up with in his childhood. He'd had a strict Protestant puritanical kind of religious upbringing, and his life as a decadent poet, his sex life with his various partners, all were a rejection of that. And instead, he substituted with the notion that there is a new religion that he wanted promoting that had been revealed to him. And this new religion was going to be the religion of the phallic worship. So when you look at here, you're looking at a famous book, The Worship of Priapus, published in 1786 by English scholar Richard Payne Knight, based on what you can see in the print on the left, which are a series of little wax phalli, which had been collected by Sir William Hamilton, who was the English ambassador in Naples and husband of Emma Hamilton. And he had found these being used by the Italian peasantry as fertility symbols. And he then sent them to the Society of Antiquaries in London. And one of its members, Richard Payne Knight, then produced a book on the account of the remains of the worship of Priapus. Now, Priapus is the Latin name for the Roman god of erections, and therefore he was actually trying to work out what had been the role of sex in ancient religion. And in the 1780s in London, there were various writers, Pierre-François Dugues d'Ancaville, and then Richard Payne Knight, Volney, and so on, who actually came up with the idea that the origin of religion was from, again, primitive understandings of creation and sexuality. And what Payne Knight did was to argue that the original religion of mankind had actually been a worship of the powers of creation that brought the universe, the world, nature, man, and everything into existence. And that this worship was going to be worship of the male and female principles. And that primitive man, by false analogy, assumed that the creation of things in the universe must have been actually like the process of human creation and reproduction. And therefore, he wrote this book on how there was a phallic origin to religion. But this is the 1780s, and in the 1780s, Clive had just been winning over in India, and therefore among the plates and the pictures which show classical phallic imagery, he also included this, which is a sculpture that had been found at Elephanta near Calcutta. And as you can see, this is very obviously a piece of Tantric Hindu temple art. And therefore, he was getting across to England, even in the 1780s, the notion that there might be this phallic religion. And Crowley read and noted from this book, and also had the opportunity to read lots of other books that were being produced at the time on the phallic origin of religion. Reader in Charing Cross Road produced this little series of popular books, which are all on the subject of phallic worship. And when you look at the covers, you see how they are in fake vellum. And then it says it's a book about fishes, fire, and flowers. And it's got this kind of Art Nouveau design on it. But the interior text is going to be all about how this is really all symbols of phallism and the lingam yoni. And then he talks about, as you can see, the crux ansata. And the crux ansata is actually the Egyptian hieroglyph, which is, according to these books, the origin of the Christian cross. But it's a cross which is in the shape of a T without the final upright on the Christian cross. And therefore, Crowley was heavily influenced by these ideas that the Christian religion was all about Puritanism and repression, and that he wanted to create instead a new kind of religion, which was going to be based on the powers in the universe of sexuality. So he set out to actually find where these mysteries had survived. And this is his signature, which he always used, whereas you can see very blatantly, he took the letter A for Alistair as phallic. And therefore, this is him and his ideas. He had been in the Golden Dawn. He'd been to Egypt and discovered the mysteries of the law of do as you will sexually. And then he also got interested in another heretical organization of the Knights Templars. Real Knights Templars, like in this medieval manuscript, were genuinely knights, soldiers, and priests who went with the Crusades to try and recapture Jerusalem. But in the course of doing that, they became very wealthy, partly from booty and partly because they were given lots of lands to pay for their expeditions. And therefore, in the early 14th century, the Knights Templars were famously shut down by the King of France, who wanted basically their land and their wealth. And as you can see in this picture here, they were arrested, tortured, made to make false confessions, and then, as you can see, they were burnt. So here you've got the Templars being burnt, and Crowley got interested in the confessions and what they were accused of. They were accused of having been corrupted by the East, of having got to the Holy Land and giving up Christianity, and instead taking up Muslim ideas of Muhammad. And then the claim was that they started worshipping a god called Baphomet, which is really a misspelling of, in medieval Latin, Muhammad. And they were supposed to have taken up the ideas of Baphomet and therefore worshipped the devil himself. They were also supposed to have been a celibate brotherhood, all male knights, and therefore they were accused of worshipping Baphomet by kissing his arse. And then the claim was that they were homosexual, so that propaganda in the Middle Ages is similar to propaganda at all other times, where any form of sexual deviancy you don't like is imposed upon people. But we saw how in the 19th century, this design by Eliphas Levi began to make a cult out of Baphomet. This is from Eliphas Levi's Dogma and Ritual of Magic, and he claimed that the Templars really did worship a kind of spirit, this Baphomet kind of figure with its horned goat head, and that this was a powerful spirit that you could actually invoke through ritual magic. And therefore, in Germany, at the end of the 19th century, this man, Karl Gellner, was going to actually help to create, out of Templar Freemasonry, a special organization of his own called the OTO. And this is their emblem, where you can see that it's a mixture of Egyptian hieroglyphs, the eye of God. Then you've got the yoni, haven't you, in the vesica, which is the oval shape that it fits into. And then it fits into Christian iconography of the dove descending. Then you've got a cross, which is like the Nazi, later German cross, and then it's descending into a cup. And when you look at the next image, which is from the later ETO, you can see that it's again meant to be linked to solar worship. And then you've got the sigils at the bottom of Ordo Templis Orientis, OTO. And Alistair Crowley did what he did to the GD, the Golden Dawn, to the OTO. He bought his way in and bought certificates. He then tried to actually take it over, and he actually organized ritual magic. And this is him in his vestments as a priest of the OTO. And he also started to sign himself as Baphomet, where you can see in the next picture the way in which he's taken his signature, but then he's linked it to Baphomet, and then he's got this very non-Christian cross, which is there, and which is actually showing the idea, the way in which he believed that he was not only possessed by the spirit of Horus and Iwas, but also by Baphomet. And he then produced a ritual called the Liber Agape. And here you've got a book that says Liber Agape, and agape should mean Christian asexual charity. But in fact, in Crowley's version, Do What You Will means that it is actually a book of sexual magic. And you can then see the decoration on it is a crux ansata, which is the T shape, and then two circles, which are testicles. And therefore, he's creating designs for a new system of sexual magic. So he raided ancient Egypt, heretics, Freemasonry, Templars, all sorts of different kinds of occult tradition had an influence on him and appeared in the pages of the Equinox. But really, what is interesting about Crowley's new system of magic is that it's to do with the will. And therefore, if you look at this photo famously of him, this is his image of himself actually getting into the meditation mode by which he's going to actually be able to bring about occult visions. And he wrote a lot about how magic is really psychological. It's really inside your own head, and it's to do with imagination and willpower. In later life, he read a lot of Freud, and his vocabulary often includes talking about how his ideas actually come from his unconscious. But although he used Freudian vocabulary, he did actually believe in the reality of what he was describing. And he didn't only talk about these occult visions in his unconscious, but believed that they were really actually going to be spirits that came to him. And he got involved in a whole series of ways of actually improving your imagination, your will, by various different sorts of occult. Ritual was very important to him. This is one of his girlfriends, Leymah Waddell, and he organized at the Caxton Hall in 1911 a reconstruction of the rites of Eleusis. Eleusis is a Greek festival from ancient Greece, which was all about reconstructing your life, and it really did exist. And he read about it in lots of books, and he actually had it enacted by Leymah and his friends in the Caxton Hall as a public performance involving music and dance. And he also used a lot of drugs in his occult rituals, from moving from cannabis to cocaine and to heroin, really heavy drug use, which gave him all kinds of visions. And therefore, this was the new kind of magic that he was going to create. But he then had these kind of special rituals, which he called workings. And the workings were going to be organized with his friends and various different kind of levels. And he produced this, which is from the OTO, the Order of Templars, and it says Ecclesiae Gnosticae Catholicae, of a mass. And he created what was called a Gnostic mass. The Gnostics were early followers of Christ, and from the modern discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, obviously we know that they were actually a mystical form of Christianity, but they were discarded by the church and called heretics and banned. And when you ban a heresy, what you do is to try and vilify them in the worst possible ways. So the claims of the early Christian writers were that Gnostics did things like blood sacrifices, not only of animals, but even possibly of humans. And then they tried to make them out to be bestial and subhuman by claiming that any kind of sexual activity that you could possibly imagine was going to have been done by the Gnostics in their orgies. But to Crowley, the Gnostic Mass was going to be do what you will and offer him the chance to use all sorts of sexual techniques, workings, which he believed were going to enable him to achieve different levels of occult power and imagination. And therefore, he embarked on a series of magic rituals. He had at this time a boyfriend, the poet Victor Neuburg, who you can see in this picture here, and they went on holiday to Algeria in 1909-10, and this is a later book describing, allegedly, magic in the desert, where he and Neuburg went out into the desert. They drew all sorts of magic circles and symbols in the sand. They then lay together in the sand and had sex, and he, Crowley, described how he felt himself to be possessed by gods and given the power and force of gods. And he claimed that by having sex with Neuburg, he and Neuburg were going to be able to rise from the physical plane to a higher plane. And this was in 1909-10 in Algeria. And then he produced a book called The Paris Workings, which describe how later in Paris, just before First World War, he produced Opus Lutetianae, the Paris Working, in this book. And in it, again, he describes the rituals that he went through with all sorts of levels of magic. And the Gnostic Mass and the sexual magic could involve simply masturbation. It could also involve female partners, so that one of his girlfriends, that Leah Waddell, who we saw in The Rites of Eleusis, he thought was an incarnation of the Whore of Babylon. And then his boyfriends could also be the spirits helping to achieve the spiritual ecstasy that he claimed to have experienced under the influence of drugs and sex in these workings. But he'd relied in England on rich patrons who paid for the secret knowledge in his books, paid to be allowed to join in his rituals. His own inherited money was running out. And in 1914, they were faced with World War I, and he went to America. And when he was in America, he had a bad time because he got involved with various Americans who were on the German side, and he was accused in the English papers of actually being pro-German and a German spy, and he began to get called, nicknamed the Great Beast because of his links to Germany. And he later claimed in autobiographies that he'd been spying for the British government on them, the German spies. But either way, he ended up with a series of mistresses, lack of money, and in 1918, new version of Alistair Crowley, he becomes a painter. And therefore, we're now going to look at the way in which he actually believed that he was creating a magical form of art. And this is his self-portrait, which is in the National Portrait Gallery. And you can see how he is painting himself as a kind of spirit guide. And this is a relatively straightforward, realistic image, where he's making these magical sign gestures. But most of his self-portraits are going to be more like this. And you can see at the top, the Liber Legis, do what thou wilt, do as you wish. And then he paints himself in this way with these really strange kind of eyes, or here in a kind of Eastern Muslim kind of magical costume. And as you can see on the top of the scepter, do you see there's a sign of Baphomet? So this is him as a mystic seer. And he also included in his paintings his girlfriends. And therefore, when you look at this is a lost painting of a girlfriend in America called Leah Herzig. And this is his portrait of her. And it was actually a triptych. It was actually part of 3 paintings. And its meaning was supposed to be that you have her in the center. Around her were supposed to be paintings of dead souls. And as you know, his rituals believed that he could actually invoke spirits from the past to come into modern human bodies. And therefore, when he paints her like this, she's really meant to look like, again, Babylon, the whore of Babylon, who was his mistress. He then did paintings which were going to be kind of visions of his own. So when you look at that, you're looking at him doing a painting which is of a spirit that he claimed to have seen. We saw how Blake did the flea as a spirit. Well, this strange, superhuman kind of being is again meant to be an actual spirit that he had invoked in one of his rituals. And he also did paintings which were going to be apparently straightforward kind of landscapes. And you've got in the background, the center, the moon, and then you can see various little figures appearing to worship the moon on the earth below. And then he painted images like this, which is an image of red monks carrying a goat across a mountain to the sky. This is presumably a parody on religion because he hated Christianity. And the goat is traditionally a symbol of the devil, who, as we saw, Goya painted, which is worshipping in the Sabbat. And therefore he often did pictures of witches, the witches, and the woman here is, we want the next one. The woman here is meant to be the witch, and therefore this is meant to be from Goethe's Faust, and it's meant to be the end of the Sabbat, and you can see a red sun appearing in the morning sky, and you can see how the witches are dancing at the end of their meeting. They're viewed by a kind of man on the left, which is a kind of satyr, and then you can see bottom left, there's definitely a magic mushroom, isn't there? And therefore, he was beginning to paint pictures which are going to be about witchcraft and magic. He talked about the paintings that he did and explained them in an interview in American papers in 1919. And he said that he was a subconscious impressionist and that what he was doing was to show visions from his subconscious. Now, it seems to me that really he's much more closely linked, if into any art movements at all, to expressionism. If you can go back, Tony, you go back to the pictures which are more in an expressionist kind of style. That if you could have the portrait of Leah, that's it. That is very similar to the kind of things that the Blue Rider were producing and were to do with German expressionism and Die Brücke in the early 20th century. And then when you get a head like this, the head of the devil, that is very similar to what we saw being produced by the German expressionists and symbolists in the 1890s. And then when you get to a landscape like this, the landscape, again, is going to be similar to expressionist landscapes by Kokoschka. But he's saying that these are actually coming from his subconscious, and he claimed that he received the ideas to actually paint these paintings automatically. And therefore, this is 1918, 1919. This is 5 years before the Surrealist Manifesto and André Breton beginning to write about psychic automatism. And therefore, I think that you can link what he's doing to expressionism and also to surrealism. And if you like, as opposed to thinking that they're very unskilled paintings, if you like his paintings, I found one on the net yesterday, a little landscape drawing in black and white, and it would only cost you £25,000. So there's a big following for Alistair Crowley and his paintings, as well as his magic beliefs. But by now, he was being vilified in the English press. The Daily Express had a campaign claiming that he was a great beast working for the Germans, and that his black magic involved sex orgies and violence and sadism and murder. And therefore, he decided in 1920 to get out of the country, and he got residence and took up this little kind of virtually hut at Cefalù in Sicily. And he created a little occult community there and called this place the Abbey of the Leymah, the Abbey of you do whatever you want, what you will. And he had there his mistress, Leymah. She had children, she had abortions, the hygiene was really bad, various people died. The Daily Express claimed by occult satanic magic, but probably from food poisoning. And then various rich people came and tried out the lifestyle or tried to buy secrets of magic from him. And he stayed there for 3 years and then came back and had a long career as an occultist, writing novels and getting a cult following in England till he died in 1947. But as you can see, his hut in Cefalù is pretty much, even today, a ruin. But it got a revival in 1955 when an American filmmaker called Kenneth Anger, who was interested in the occult and Crowley, went and visited it. And Kenneth Anger is famous for creating this film called Scorpio Rising. And you can see when you look at the advert for it that it's all about gay leather bikers, which was his thing, and which was part of the education that David Utterson received at his school, with this film being shown to their film society. Kenneth Anger went there, and to his amazement, he found that inside the ruined villa, there were actually still the mural decorations that had been put up there. And what you've got here is a selection of these kind of pictures that were painted by Crowley on the walls of the villa. They're in pretty bad condition. They were done with a considerable lack, I would claim, of skill, but they do perhaps show, interestingly, his ideas. You've got the texts that he liked to use in his books of magic. Then you've got these various sorts of beings that appear there. They're often going to be images of devils and spirits. That, again, obviously is another of these self-portraits, isn't it? And therefore, he decorated the villa with what he thought was suitable paintings for an abbey of Leymah, of do what they will. And therefore, in the scenes, what you've got are basically couples having sex, both male and female. You've got hermaphrodites, you've got lesbians, you've got demons of lust, you've got Leah Hirsig with a symbolic cup, and therefore he put lots of his occult beliefs into these paintings on the walls. And I'm not going to claim that they are of any interest as art and aesthetic pleasure, but they do show how he tried to embody the occult ideas that he developed into paintings as well. But to me, a much more significant artist of the occult is going to be this man, who is Austin Osmond Spare. He was born in South London, the son of a policeman. He grew up poor in Kennington. He went to Lambeth Art College, and he got a job working in a glass factory, helping do designs for presumably sort of Art Nouveau kind of glass. And his work was seen by Sir William Blake Richmond visiting the glassworks in Whitefriars. And as you probably know, Sir William Blake Richmond had his studio just next to where we are now, where I am now, in St. Peter's Square. And therefore, he was recommended to actually go and get an artistic education. and he went and attended the Royal College of Art, at that point based in Kensington. But he didn't enjoy it, he didn't like it, he rebelled against the kind of academic teaching that was there, and therefore he is really much more of a self-taught kind of artist than one who actually had a formal academic kind of art training. When he was 17, in 1903-4, his father sent some of his drawings to the Royal Academy, and they got exhibited, and it got noticed in the press that he was the youngest artist to actually be exhibiting in the Royal Academy in 1904. And what his father had sent were going to be these, which are his kind of bookplate designs. Next picture.
Gone out of order.
There, that's it. And that is what actually got him noticed and famous. And you can see there how he's actually working in a kind of Beardsley-esque sort of style with Art Nouveau kind of plants. And he got taken up by quite rich patrons, ex libris Andrei Rafalovich. Now, Rafalovich was a friend and enemy of Oscar Wilde and bought lots of his work. And therefore, he began to get patrons and could actually become an independent artist. And you can see why he made such a stir, because if you go back, Tony, to the self-portrait, this is the kind of level of draftsmanship that he could achieve even as a young man. And if you think of terms of the skill of chiaroscuro, of actually modeling a face and hair like this, and then if you think of the skill of catching the kind of intensity in the face and the eyes, you can see why he actually was widely admired as an artist. And as an artist, he was also capable of doing high quality nudes. So if you can move forward there, that's it. This is slightly later, but when you look at a nude like this, doesn't it actually remind you very strongly of Lucian Freud? Yet this is actually produced in the 1920s and shows how he was able to do drawing, paintings, which are confrontational and taking on the realism of an actual woman, and are far away from the academic tradition of doing pictures which are going to be idealized nudes. But he was also becoming interested in the occult, and he begins to produce his own books. So if you can go back to here, this is one of the first self-printed, self-designed books he produced, a book of satires, and he was himself thinking that he was following in the traditions of Blake and designing and producing whole books. And what he was trying to do is to satirize the society that was going to reject him and mock government, politics, and religion. And therefore, he began to have a successful career as a book illustrator. Then in the First World War, he became a war artist. In the 1930s, he was briefly taken up as foreshadowing surrealism. And therefore, he had a kind of artistic career up until the 1930s, but he was difficult to get on with. He had exhibitions in central London, but by the 1930s, they were drying up, and he was reduced to living in poverty in Kennington. His rooms were bombed in the Blitz in 41, and lots of his work was destroyed. And after the war, he was a forgotten artist. He was not able to actually exhibit in the West End or receive any kind of critical notices. And instead, he got to the stage where he was simply drinking in pubs. And to pay for the drink, he actually organized exhibitions in the back rooms of pubs and famously did lots of paintings of the sort of working class characters like this that were there. But he got kind of revived because a pair, Kenneth and Steffi Grant, were very interested in the ideas of Crowley, who had died in 1947. And they knew that Spare had had links to Crowley back in 1907. And therefore, they investigated him and interviewed him. And they began to discover that he was still producing paintings and that he had developed a system of beliefs where he claimed that as a child, he'd been influenced by a witch who taught him the secrets of her magic. And he claimed that he had magic inspiration. And he produced, the next picture is a kind of visionary image of the sort of paintings that he was producing at the end of his life, where you've got at the bottom left, presumably a kind of self-portrait of him, again as a priest and seer, and then floating out of the ether, you've got this vision of a spirit head that appeared to him. And therefore, in the 50s, he was revived by Kenneth Grant. And since then, he's had quite a lot of exhibitions, quite a lot of books and biographies have been written, and he's taken much more seriously now as an occult artist. But I take him seriously as an occult artist, not so much for these late works or the realism of the portraits and the nudes, but because of this book, which is called The Book of Pleasure. And I was fortunate enough years ago to find a copy and buy it. And I've got it literally here beside me. So I'm showing it to you here. Can you see? Yes, you can. Just about see it, can't you? And there it is. That is the actual Book of Pleasure. And I'm going to claim that this, which was produced in 1913, is the book that actually is the high point of his occult art. When you look at the title page of the book, you see what the book is going to be about. There it says, Book of Pleasure, Self-Love, the Psychology of Ecstasy. And what he did was to claim that this book, with its text plus its pictures, were inspired by spirits that came to him in his occult ceremonies through a process of meditation. And the frontispiece of the book is this magnificent drawing, which shows him in a state of meditation. This is actually called the death posture. And by the death posture, he didn't mean actual death, but he created a system of belief where he wanted, through meditation, to die to the things of this world. He wanted to, what he said was, kiaize himself. And he thought of the world and the physical matter of the world around him as Zos, Z-O-S. And then the inner self, the real power from outside, the spirit in you, was Kia, K-I-A, Kia. And he wanted to kiaize himself. And to do so, he created all these kind of rituals. He'd originally got interested in the ideas of Theosophy, but in 1907, Alistair Crowley had seen his work and visited him and influenced his ideas. And he joined into one of Crowley's orders and was taught what the Crowley rituals could be. And it's not at all clear what their relationship was, because he came to dislike Crowley and distance himself from Crowley, but it's thought possible that they were lovers in 1907 or so, when he was a young man. But basically what he did was to take up some of Crowley's ideas on the psychology of magic and willpower, and then develop his own system of beliefs. And here he is in his death posture. He has on the table in front of him all these strange little statuettes and images, which are of gods and goddesses from primitive religions. And he believed that he could get in touch with them and in contact with them and be given visions by them. And he's then got this strange kind of bird creature floating on his head. And this is because he was interested in Zoroastrianism, and Ahriman, the spirit of fire in Zoroastrianism, is actually shown as a winged being like this. And it is actually, as you can see, descending and coming to him and into him. And it allows him to then take up death of the physical world and in his mind's eye, in his imagination, use these objects to actually get into a higher state of consciousness. And he does this in this very graphic style, much in the style of the German artist Max Klinger, whose work he'd admired, where he uses his realism to actually create a completely magical and surreal kind of world. And he particularly believed that you should use things like letters and sigils to actually help with the meditation. So you can see this face here, which is contorted and distorted, as if possessed, by this thing that is in the center of his forehead, a bit like an Egyptian scarab perhaps, but is actually a sigil. And you've got below the head, which is contorted by the vision it's having, a whole series of what were called sigils, and then below that, an alphabet. And he tried to create his own magical alphabet. And when you look at it, you can see that this is like Cyrillic or like Greek, but is not actually any of those things, and is in fact completely and entirely his own creation. And it's a creation that he made from his own designs and his own head. And he called it, as you can see in the next image, the alphabet of desire. Because, as you know, the book is called the Book of Self-Pleasure, which probably implies that he was getting into some sort of hallucinatory, masturbatory kind of state in which he was meditating on not only the alphabet, but also on these, which are his sigils. Now, we saw earlier that sigils were part of ritual magic. We saw that Crowley used sigils in the equinox, but these are not the same as the sigils that were used by Alistair Crowley. Alistair Crowley's sigils were the genuine, traditional, magical names of spirits, which when you drew them, drew the spirit to the sigil that you created, and therefore invoked a spirit from outside yourself. These are instead original designs of sigils by Austin Osmond Spare, and they're not actually meant to represent spirits from the world, from the outside world, from the planets or the demons, but instead, these are actually the shapes, the desires, which his own self took on. This is my wish, is the top one. And you see how that's like the Crowley, do what thou wilt. Then the next one is to obtain. Then the next one is a symbol of strength of a tiger. And then you combine them all together and you put your wishes together with the strength of things like tigers, and you obtain a mystical state of kia, a state of visionary hallucination, where you're going to actually see things from inside yourself, and therefore you project yourself into the art. Now think of how like that is to those Leadbetter pictures that we were looking at of thought forms, which influenced Kandinsky and Mondrian, where Leadbetter in 1908 had produced a book where the spirits in his head, the thought forms, could turn into abstract shapes and colours. Think also of Kandinsky in 1921, Point, Line and Plane. And Point, Line and Plane was, as you might remember, his way of actually reducing the human form and human emotions to abstract designs. Do you remember Diagonal Tensions, where he had a drawing of a straight line overcome by a twisting serpent, which was going to therefore represent, for example, male and female together? And this, produced by Spare in 1909, is actually 10 years before the abstract art of Kandinsky, and is, in my opinion, the kind of achievement of Spare, who was beginning to produce the use of abstract design to enhance emotional experience. And therefore, another of the pictures in the Book of Self-Pleasure is going to be this, which is Ecstasy, which is produced by this meditation. And when you look at the next picture, you see here the way in which you actually rise up. You start with the physical world. He was married and he had a wife, and therefore you have the voluptuous female body. But then you rise to his head. Then you rise to a figure, and you probably recognize that it is actually probably Baphomet, and that it is a hermaphrodite. And then above that, the arm lifts you up, and you rise to this horned head, which is again going to be his vision of the ecstatic forces of the universe. And therefore, the idea of the Book of Pleasure was that you meditate on magic and the occult, you meditate on statues, you meditate on words and alphabets, you meditate on your sigils that you've created, and you rise to a state of ecstasy. And this final painting is the painted version of that spirit that he visioned and saw and rose up to. And therefore, I think that the occult has had a big influence on certain sorts of almost surreal art in the 20th century. And whereas I would actually admire Gill and Epstein, I think that Crowley is a terrible painter and that his pictures are simply of intellectual interest. But I do really admire the kind of way in which Austin Osmond Spare created his own art forms. Now, there's due to be one more talk in this series, which is going to be about how art can really be magic, but I'm going to have to postpone it because I've just had the good news that the hip replacement operation that I've been waiting for 15 months is due to happen next Thursday on the 12th. And therefore, at some point in the later on, I'll be able to finish, I hope, this course by looking at the way in which art can really be magic. So thank you very much for joining us today, and see if there are any questions you want to ask.
Hello, Robert.
Hello.
You mentioned the crux and Sata earlier, yeah?
Yes.
Is this basically the Ankh?
The idea, it's a thing that was used as an Egyptian symbol for measuring the Nile, a Nilometer. So yes, you're right. Crux and Sata, the Tau cross.
Okay, and the other question is, when the Gnostics were disparaged, the first disparagement came from Bishop Irenaeus, if I'm not mistaken. But I mean,
You're quite right.
I'm not sure where the bestiality references come from. Where does that come from?
There are also lots of references in other patristic writers like Tertullian.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
but
sure.
Irenaeus is the main source. I agree.
Yeah, and when you talked about Crowley's reenactment of the Eleusinian mysteries,
yes,
was that his go-to, cocaine and heroin and marijuana to replace the kykeon, which is the sacrament, the original sacrament?
Well, I think it's to do with the way in which he came to view his own system of magic as increasingly psychological, as within himself, to do with his imagination and his will. And he obviously would see ways in which they would be affected, enhanced by all these drugs that he frequently took.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, he's not really availing himself of external spirits or other dimensions.
Well, I don't believe in external spirits, so I believe that it's all his own personal unconscious fantasies created by all these rituals and drugs.
I know you would, but ultimately, did he maintain a psychological?
He believed it was real. I think he went on believing that, although he read Freud and accepted that they were in his unconscious and he was interested in the power of the unconscious, he believed it really did actually bring him into states where he met spirits from outside himself and felt possessed by them. I think he had that. That seems to be the experience he had, and it comes across strongly in his writings, I think.
And the reference to Ahriman is very interesting, because Ahriman is the, it's the beginning of the duality of the evilness and stuff like that. So it's interesting that Osmond availing himself of Ahriman as a guiding spirit.
Yep.
It's almost a counterpoint to Christianity, or the notion of good, basically.
Yes, it could be, couldn't it? Yes.
And last question, Bohemian. Why? What's the why? I don't actually know why we
Bohemian is actually a word in French that means gypsy, because the gypsies were regarded as, again, heretical, and they were said to come from Bohemia, and it therefore, literally in French in the 19th century, La Bohème is an opera about gypsies, and then it comes to mean a gypsy lifestyle like that was adopted by Augustus John.
That makes sense. All right. Thank you, Robert. Much pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Okay, are there any more questions anyone would like to ask? Okay, thank you, Robert. The last has been absolutely fascinating and a glimpse truly into another world. And if, like me, you can't wait for more, please do follow the link to our forthcoming events page, which will be in the chat facility now. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of our upcoming lectures. Next week's lunchtime lecture on the 12th of November at the slightly later time of 2 p.m. will be on the very topical hunt for a COVID-19 vaccine. This will be given by one of our Latimarians and immunologist, Professor Mark Poznansky, who is based at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. And also next week on the 10th of November from the 7 to 8 p.m, we will host our Zoom interactive evening tutorial with former head Peter Winter. This will be the first of a series of 3 interactive evening discussions on French literature. This week, Peter will talk about Charles Baudelaire's life and works before focusing on a poem from Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil. I'd also like to highlight the ever popular former parents evening classes that are coming up. Firstly, backed by popular demand, Johnny White, who's head of history here at Latimer, will be teaching the background to the Arab-Israeli conflict on Wednesdays from Wednesday the 13th of January for 10 weeks. Also, we've got coming up British Cinema Part 1. Luke Maxted will be teaching this new course under the Celluloid Dreams umbrella. This term will cover a wide range of genres and directors, from British gangster and Ealing comedies to Carry On and 007. Many people have already seen a lot of the films and of course no subtitles. And that'll be from the 14th of January on Thursdays for 10 weeks. So if you'd like to sign up for any of these or for more information, please head to our website and there'll be a link again in the chat. And there's also a link to our donations page and the link to the video library, where, as mentioned previously, you'll find recordings from our lecture series to enjoy at your leisure. So that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you, Robert, for sharing your incredible knowledge of and passion for art. And I hope we will see you all again very soon.